Hi there. My final project is studying whether or not there is a relationship between optimism and the likelihood of one committing violence against others. So, in terms of understanding some of the past literature on this topic, I personally was unable to find any sources that directly analyze the effects of optimism on one's likelihood of committing violence. However, there's been a lot of indirect connections linking other related variables to violence. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. First of all, higher optimism is associated with higher self efficacy and self esteem, and low self esteem is one of the many predictive factors of committing violence. Additionally, low optimism is associated with higher rates of mood and anxiety disorders and less effective coping strategies in stressful situations. So, particularly when we're thinking about coping strategies, if someone has less effective coping strategies, they're likely to turn to more violent behaviors as opposed to non-violent coping, such as deep breathing, journaling, things such as that. And lastly, optimism is related to pro-social behavior, which directly contrasts violence. So, pro-social behavior is anything that is helping another person, typically without, it benefiting you. And when we think about violence, that's directly harming another person. Violence happens at the expense of another, so it is non-pro-social behavior. So in terms of why I kind of did the research that I wanted to do, when I was looking at some of the past, literature, um, I really noticed that there was a gap on directly connecting this optimism and violence variable. And the goal of my research is to fill in this gap. My thought process behind it was that, one's belief in their future success, optimism, may impact their desire to preserve their current stability. So if one, feels hopeful for their future, they may want to prevent themselves from putting themselves in unsafe or potentially unstable situations, which violence tends to cause. If you're getting suspended from school or, the person you're committing violence against reciprocates against you, that's putting yourself in an unsafe and potentially unstable situation. So that's kind of the thought processing behind why I wanted to connect these two variables together. So then in terms of returning back to my research question, I'm studying whether or not there's a relationship between one's optimism and their likelihood of committing violence against others. And my hypothesis is that a relationship will exist. As I've kind of discussed with this thing about preserving, one's safety, I do believe that the lower one's sense of optimism is, the higher their chance of committing violence against others will be. And then same inversely, if they're more optimistic, they're going to be less likely to commit violence against others. And in terms of the importance of this, optimism is much more malleable than many of the other risk factors for violence. So, for example, home environment, experiencing abuse, genetic predisposition to violence, all those things are much more innate within a person than optimism is. And so, optimism training has been shown to be very effective. So, if we can link optimism to violence, we can potentially prevent violence through increasing one's optimism through these optimism trainings and, through treating it, being able to take advantage of the fact that it is malleable. And if we are able to prevent violence, then we can both further an adolescent's future success and also protect others from, experiencing violence at the hand of a violent individual. So, in terms of studying this question, I looked at the Ad Health dataset, which is a large questionnaire um, of that was conducted on many different U.S. adolescents from 1994 to 1995. And it was a stratified random sample. So they pulled from a lot of different groups and they pulled randomly from those groups. So, you have schools, you have higher income schools, you have lower income schools, you have different races and genders. And it's meant to be representative of all US adolescents. Because it was a very comprehensive and well-conducted data set, it's generally pretty generalizable to all US adolescents. And this is a secondary data analysis, so it's quasi-experimental. Meaning I didn't directly, you know, control any of the variables. I'm just looking at this questionnaire. And there was a bunch of different waves of the questionnaire, but I'm specifically looking at wave one. So they conducted it a bunch of different times, but I'm looking at wave one particularly. And my sample includes all participants who answered my question of interest, which I'll talk about in the constructs section. So in terms of demographics for my sample, here's a little bit of general information. And I just want to highlight that there might be slightly more females than there were males um, in the participants. So females made up 51.6% and males made up 48.4%. And then the majority group, as representative of US adolescents in 1994 and 1995 is white. So 57.5%. And then African Americans is the next closest, which is 22.5%. And then they have many other ethnic groups as well, but those were in lower percentages. So then in terms of my constructs, or the things that I was studying, I have two constructs. I have an independent and a dependent variable. And my independent variable, my construct one, is optimism. And optimism is one's hopefulness or confidence that their future will be successful. And typically this is a subjective construct, but this was generalized because I'm pulling from pre-existing data. It was generalized to societal concepts of lifetime success. And this is something that I'll discuss more in the limitations section, but it's just an important thing to be thinking about now and also to know before I kind of talk about some of my questions that I used for the optimism variable. And then my second construct, my dependent variable, is physical violence against others. So looking more specifically at construct one, I pulled 4 questions from the AdHealth data set. And that is, what is the chance that you will live to age 35? What is the chance that you will be married by age 25? How often in the past week did you feel hopeful about the future? And on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is low and 5 is high, how likely is it that you will go to college? And the first 2 variables, the chance you will live to age 35 and the chance you will be married by age 25, were studied on a scale from almost no chance to almost certain. And it was a scale of 1 to 5. And then how often in the past week did you feel hopeful about the future? That was on the scale of never or rarely. So that was 0, all the way to most of the time or all the time, which was a 3. And they could answer anywhere in that range. And of course, the college question was ranked on a scale of 1 to 5. So because all of these questions were studied on different scales, in order to create one variable that included all of them, I had to standardize the scales for the variables. And to do this, I used a z-score table. So I standardized them on a z-score. And my optimism variable, once they were standardized, is a mean of all of these 4 questions. So they're mean responses. So then when we're looking kind of at how participants responded to the 4 optimism questions, the mean and standard deviation, because this is a standardized on a z-score table, it doesn't have much meaning. It's 0 and then 0.598 is the standard deviation. But when we look at the shape of the graph, we can, see a little bit about the way they answer the question. So it has a slight left skew. There's more responses on the higher end of optimism. So that indicates that participants generally were more optimistic, were higher in their responses, higher values in their responses to the optimism questions that I chose. And then construct 2, violence. I used 1 question for that, and that is, in the past 12 months, how often have you gotten into a physical fight? There were other variables in the AdHealth data set that correlated or were connected to violence. Like, for example, in the past 12 months, how often did you shoot or stab somebody? But these consisted of a lot of outliers, and they're not really common things. They're not adding a lot of data because not many people have shot or stabbed somebody. So I chose instead to just look at this 1 question, which had significantly more people who had said that they had done it. And so then when we're looking at this graph, like I said, there's a decent amount of people. Most people are in never, but there's a decent amount of people who said that they had gotten into a physical fight once or more than once in the past 12 months. And the mean is 0.45, so somewhere between never and once, and the standard deviation is 0.716. So that's how much variability there is. And then in terms of how I analyzed these variables, I ran a correlation because both variables are continuous variables. Both my optimism variable and my violence variable are continuous. So I ran a correlation because I wanted to look for the relationship between these 2 continuous variables. And after running it, I found a significant negative correlation between one's optimism and their likelihood of committing violence against others. There was an R value of negative 0.171, which is a significant but weak correlation. But yeah, it was very significant. The p-value was less than 0.001. And what the R value, the negative 0.170, indicates is that the more optimistic an adult is, the less likely they are to commit violence against others. And you can see that here in this regression line, although I didn't run a regression, this is just for visual purposes. You can kind of see, as someone is more optimistic, their physical violence that they're committing is going down steadily. So, and then I also reran these correlation to look specifically at how optimism relates to violence for males and how it relates to violence for females. And for males, again, statistically significant, negative 0.134. So as they're committing, or as they have higher optimism, they're committing less violence. Same for females, it was slightly larger, negative 0.179, but again, statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. So the more optimistic a female is, the less likely they are to commit violence, and same for males. So in conclusion, I did find a relationship between optimism and violence. The lower one's sense of optimism, the higher their chance of committing violence will be, and then vice versa. And going back to some of the limitations that I mentioned a little bit before, one of the main limitations with this is that third variable problems are likely. So because higher optimism is associated with higher self-efficacy and self-esteem and more effective coping strategies and pro-social behavior, all of these things are also related to violence. So all these things may be acting as confounding variables. So for example, pro-social behavior may be impacting one's optimism and impacting their likelihood of committing violence, but these two variables may not be impacting each other on a direct relationship. So that's potential confounders. Additionally, because I ran a correlation and because I was looking at pre-existing data set, this doesn't have any predictive power. I didn't run an experiment, so I can't say that optimism predicts one's likelihood of committing violence. And then finally, the independent variable, as I kind of discussed before, may not have high validity, so it may not actually represent one sense of optimism. If we look at some of my questions, they're more based on societal, normal societal pacing. So for example, what is the chance you'll be married by age 25? That's a question I still wanted to include because it does kind of have to do with this idea of future success. But, if someone doesn't ever want to get married, they have no interest in that, then they may still be an optimistic individual, but just not be interested in getting married. And so then when we're looking at future research, really experimental research has to be conducted that controls for some of these limitations and also potentially like re-explores this optimism variable and defines it in a way that's more accurate to an individual's actual true optimism rather than these, societal concepts of success. But this research that I've done is still impactful because it's the first research showing this direct correlation between optimism and violence. And this provides a good jumping off point for future researchers to explore and do it in more experimental ways that potentially have more predictive power between these two variables. And then this is my works cited. Thank you.